What if the chains forged to bind a woman's flesh became the very hinges upon which her vengeance swung? Listen carefully, for I will not repeat this twice. In the haunted summer of 1849, Mississippi was a land where silence itself had been enslaved. Whispers did not belong to the enslaved. Songs did not belong to the enslaved. Even grief, even tears, belonged to the masters, who measured human suffering the way they measured their cotton yields, with ledgers, with lashes, with cruel precision. But there was one woman who refused to give her pain away. Her name was Hannah, and though history tried to bury her beneath the whitewash of plantation myths, the soil still remembers. Picture her, small, quiet, wrists hardened by endless labor. To the colonel, she was property, a body moving in rhythm with his orders. To the brothers, she was less than that, an object of derision, of appetite, of cruelty wielded for amusement. They thought her silence meant brokenness. They thought the chains that bruised her wrists were symbols of their triumph. But silence is not always defeat. Sometimes silence is the sound of a mind sharpening its teeth. In those years, Hannah learned everything the house thought it had hidden. She learned which stair creaked beneath a drunkard's heel. She learned which locks had a second key and where that key slept. She studied the weight of chains as others studied scripture, and she learned the rhythms of cruelty, when the lash cracked, when laughter rose, when arrogance weakened into carelessness. Every insult, every bruise, every theft of body and soul was tallied in a ledger only she could see, and in the cold arithmetic of that ledger, debts had grown monstrous. Her grief for a child ripped from her arms, the bruises left on women who never learned to weep in front of others, the nights when men swaggered through the quarters with the sten, each of whiskey, scattering fear like sparks. She carried it all, not as victim, not as supplicant, but as witness. You were not meant to hear this story. They buried it with fire and ash, yet the echoes remain, and tonight I will open that door. Come closer. For once you hear how Hannah turned chains into vengeance, you will not leave unchanged. This is not merely history. This is initiation. The brothers believed themselves untouchable, gods in human form walking across fields soaked in sweat not their own. Colonel Tate had raised them on stories of conquest, of white dominion over the earth, and the boys had drunk every drop of that poison until it coursed through their veins like scripture. They carried pistols on their hips, not because they feared resistance, but because it thrilled them to imagine one. They paraded through the quarters with smirks, tossing coins into the dirt just to watch children scramble for them like starving dogs. To them, cruelty was not an act, it was a performance. But Hannah watched with different eyes. Every cruelty performed was a curtain lifted, revealing their weaknesses. The younger brother, Amos, loved to hear himself speak, whiskey loosening his tongue until secrets spilled like molasses. The older, Silas, loved control. He needed order, needed his word to be law, needed every gaze to bow when he entered a room. Their arrogance was not armor, it was glass, and Hannah, in her silence, was learning where to strike. The quarters whispered of escape, but Hannah did not dream of distant lands. No, her imagination was not the soft dream of running, but the sharp, cold geometry of reckoning. What good was freedom if the men who had built their thrones upon her bones remained breathing, unpunished? She did not want to flee. She wanted to make the walls of that plantation tremble. One night, under a swollen moon, she pressed her palm to the iron shackle that circled her wrist. The metal was cold, heavy, but also instructive. Chains, she realized, were not just bonds. They were tools, if one had the patience to learn their weight. She practiced moving with them, turning her wrists against them, lifting small stones to feel how they clinked and shifted. What the brothers had given her as humiliation, she began to reshape into mastery. And the land itself seemed to conspire with her. Cicadas screamed in the night like warning bells. The swamp that bordered the fields whispered secrets through its reeds. Even the air hung thick, as though waiting for something to snap. Hannah felt it in her bones, an invisible pressure, history itself demanding release. The day would come. She would not rush it. Revenge was a harvest, and like all crops in Mississippi soil, it needed time to ripen. Until then, she waited, watched, listened. Silence was her weapon, and patience her blade. The cruelty worsened with the heat. Mississippi summers were suffocating. Air so thick with humidity, it clung to the skin like damp cloth. The brothers grew restless in the heat, their tempers sharp, their hands quicker to strike. Silas took pleasure in testing Hannah's endurance, forcing her to hold water buckets until her arms shook, then laughing when she collapsed. Amos, drunk more often than sober, would trail her in the halls of the big house, muttering filth in her ear, knowing she could not flinch or speak. They mistook her silence for powerlessness. They never understood it was a silence full of teeth. The quarters spoke of Hannah with pity, sometimes with awe. "She don't cry," the women whispered, "not even when they try to break her." But Hannah was not without feeling. Every lash, every insult burned inside her, forging something sharper than steel. She did not show them her rage, but in the stillness of night, with only the whippoorwills calling, she let her hatred settle into shape. She was no longer a woman merely surviving. She was becoming an architect of ruin. One night, Amos staggered back from town, drunk and boastful, bragging of card games and easy women. He dropped his pistol on the parlor floor, laughing as he fumbled with his boots. Hannah, kneeling silently to clean the hearth, noted the way the weapon slid beneath the chair. How close her hand could come to it without notice. For a fleeting second, her fingers brushed the handle. Power, real and immediate, rested beneath her touch. She withdrew before he noticed, but in that instant she knew. The tools of their dominion could be stolen, turned. Days later, Silas ordered her to polish the shackles they used for punishment. The iron gleamed under her cloth, cold and merciless. But as she rubbed oil into the metal, her mind reshaped the object. Shackles to them were humiliation. To her, I became memory, weight, opportunity. She studied the locks, the pins, the way the hinges turned. She stored it all away. And slowly, she began to plant seeds of unease. A tool misplaced here, a door left open there. Nothing that screamed rebellion, only small, almost invisible disruptions. A key, not where it should be. A lantern gone missing. A sound in the hallway at night that no one could trace. The brothers began to bicker, blaming each other, their arrogance cracking at the edges. Hannah said nothing. She only listened to the sound of their voices unraveling, the way rope frays strand by strand before it finally snaps. The house had always belonged to them. Soon, it would belong to their fear. The house began to breathe with dread, though the brothers did not name it as such. At first, it was only irritations, a gate that swung open though it had been latched. The faint rattle of chains in the barn when no one stood near. The dogs barking at empty corners of the yard. Silas cursed the slaves for carelessness, while Amos laughed nervously, blaming wind and shadows. But Hannah knew better. She had learned how to bend silence into shape, how to let the smallest disturbance ripple like a stone cast into still water. At night, when the brothers drank themselves into stupors, Hannah would move with deliberate steps, shifting objects by inches. A chair angled differently, a door ajar that had been closed. She watched from the darkness as Silas frowned, unsure if he had forgotten or if someone had dared meddle with his order. Each doubt was a splinter, working its way deeper beneath the skin. The quarters began whispering of strange things too. One woman swore she heard Hannah's voice outside her cabin long after Hannah had gone to the big house. Another claimed the tool shed rattled, though no storm was near. Fear spread, but it was not fear of Hannah. It was fear of something larger, something they could not name, as though the land itself was stirring. And Hannah let them believe it. A haunting was far more useful than suspicion. Amos was the first to falter. One evening he swore he heard footsteps behind him while crossing the yard, though when he spun around, the path was empty. Sweat slicked his face, though the night was cool. He told Silas of it, but Silas only scoffed, calling him weak, a fool spooked by cicadas. Yet even Silas began to notice the shift in the air, the heavy quiet that fell before Hannah entered a room, the way lantern light seemed to gutter when she passed. Hannah never smiled, never spoke beyond necessity, but her silence was now a mirror, reflecting their own unraveling minds. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of shadow became an accusation. She wanted them to feel what she and so many others had felt for years, that the walls themselves were against them, that no breath could be taken without fear. The brothers still strutted, still barked orders, but their laughter was thin, their tempers quick. They began to carry pistols inside the house, loading them with shaking hands. They did not yet realize that fear itself was Hannah's first weapon, and it had already sunk its teeth deep into their flesh. Paranoia spread through the house like mold creeping across damp wood. Amos jumped at shadows, muttering about spirits, while Silas prowled the halls at night with his pistol cocked, convinced someone was testing his authority. But power is brittle when fear gnaws at it from within, and Hannah knew their strength was beginning to rot. She fed their unease with precision. A length of chain left coiled on the stairs where Amos would stumble over it in the dark. A whisper of her own footsteps trailing Silas until he spun, furious, into emptiness. She even left a single nail driven halfway into the parlor wall, watching as the brothers argued for an hour over who had dared mar their home. Every gesture was calculated, small enough to be dismissed, sharp enough to draw blood from their nerves. But Hannah was not reckless. She let days pass untouched, allowing them to breathe relief before tightening the noose again. Fear was most potent when it came and went, like fever rising and breaking. She wanted them unsteady, never certain when the next chill would crawl up their spines. The slaves in the quarters began to sense what she was weaving. They saw the way the brothers' eyes darted, the way their tempers snapped over nothing. Some whispered prayers at night, afraid Hannah had conjured something dark. Others whispered blessings, believing she carried justice in her silence. Hannah neither confirmed nor denied. She did not need their faith. She needed their silence. And they gave it, for they too had debts in that house's ledger. One evening, Amos found the colonel's old riding crop hanging from the rafters of his room, though he swore he had locked the door. He screamed for Silas, trembling as though the leather itself was alive. Silas ripped it down, snarling that someone was playing games, but his eyes betrayed him. He too had begun to wonder if the house itself was conspiring. And still, Hannah remained the picture of obedience. Her eyes lowered, her voice measured. But when she scrubbed bloodstains from the whipping post, her mind sharpened on the memory. She thought of her child, sold away like cattle. She thought of the women forced to bear children who were torn from them before they could speak a name. She thought of the years stolen, stacked one atop another like wood for a fire. She was not preparing an escape. She was preparing an altar. And on that altar, the brothers would pay in screams and blood. The first strike came quiet, almost tender, as though the house itself had drawn a breath and exhaled violence. It was Amos who felt it. One night, staggering to his bed with whiskey burning his gut, he collapsed onto the sheets, only to jolt upright with a scream. Beneath him, carefully placed, lay the rusted shackles once used on Hannah herself. Their cold bite clamped around his wrist as he thrashed, unable to shake free. By the time Silas burst into the room, Amos was pale and trembling, babbling that someone had meant to chain him like an animal. Silas ripped the shackle loose, roaring that his brother was a coward, but his own hands shook. He barked orders to the slaves, searching cabins, overturning cots, demanding to know who had dared mock them. No one spoke. Hannah stood among them, her face carved from stone, her silence unbreakable. The colonel had long taught his sons that fear kept slaves obedient. Yet now fear belonged to the masters. Days later, Silas discovered the barn door unlatched. Inside, hanging from a beam, dangled a noose woven from hemp rope, swaying through the air, was still. He cut it down with fury, but that night his dreams filled with creaking wood and the sound of choking breaths. He woke drenched in sweat, pistol clutched to his chest. Even Amos noticed the cracks in his armor. And Hannah pressed deeper. She timed her movements so shadows stretched unnaturally long across the parlor walls, so the faint clink of chains echoed through the hall at night. She whispered in tones just above a breath, letting her voice curl like smoke through the rafters. To the brothers, already raw with terror, it was not Hannah they heard, but the dead. All the voices buried beneath the plantation, rising to claim what was owed. Their cruelty faltered. Whippings grew less frequent. Orders lost their bite. They no longer strutted. They flinched. Even those dying. The slaves began to walk differently, shoulders lifted, eyes flickering with cautious hope. Something was shifting. Then came the night when Silas, pacing the porch with his pistol, swore he saw a figure in the field, a woman standing perfectly still, moonlight glinting off iron at her wrists. He fired into the dark, shot after shot, until the hammer clicked on emptiness. When the smoke cleared, there was no body, only the whisper of cicadas and the faint glimmer of shackles lying in the dirt. Hannah was no longer planting fear. She was harvesting it, and soon the harvest would be red. The reckoning began on a night so heavy with heat it felt like the sky itself was pressing down on the earth. The brothers had barricaded themselves in the house, pistols loaded, bottles of whiskey scattered like talismans against their own dread. Outside, cicadas shrieked, and thunder rolled far off, as if the heavens were drawing nearer to watch. Hannah moved quietly, carrying the night with her, her footsteps silent as prayer. She began with Amos. He stumbled half-drunk into the hallway, lantern in hand, muttering curses at shadows. The flame flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a silhouette at the end of the corridor. He raised the lantern, and there she was. Hannah, standing still, eyes fixed on him, chains glinting at her wrists. Before he could cry out, the lantern sputtered and died, plunging him into darkness. What followed was not chaos. It was precise. A strike of iron across his temple, the weight of chains wrapping his arms, pinning him. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by thunder as Hannah dragged him, thrashing, into the room where the shackles lay waiting. For years, those irons had bound flesh in submission. Tonight, they bound flesh in judgment. Silas burst in at the sound, pistol raised, but his hands shook. The flash of lightning revealed his brother chained to the whipping post, eyes wide with terror, and Hannah standing beside him, silent as stone. Silas fired, the shot deafening in the small room, but the bullet struck wood, splinters flying. Before he could reload, Hannah swung the chain in her hands like a hammer, the iron catching his wrist, sending the pistol clattering across the floor. The struggle was brutal, close. Silas fought like a cornered beast, but fear had already hollowed him. Hannah's silence never broke, not even when she drove him to his knees. She locked the collar of a shackle around his throat and dragged him beside his brother. The two men who had strutted through fields of suffering now knelt in the dust of their own house, gasping, pleading. Outside, slaves gathered at the edges of the yard, drawn by the commotion, by the thunder, by something deeper. The pull of justice long denied. No one moved to stop her. No one spoke. They only watched, wide-eyed, as Hannah raised the chains above her head. The house groaned with the storm as iron fell. Screams tore through the night, raw and ragged, until they broke into silence. And in that silence, for the first time, Hannah's breath came easy. When the storm broke, the rain came hard and merciless, washing blood into the soil. The brothers' bodies lay where they had fallen, bound in the very chains they once wielded. Their mouths were open, but no breath passed through. For the first time, the plantation was silent, not with the silence of submission, but with the silence of something ended. The slaves stood in the yard, rain streaking their faces, watching as Hannah lowered the chains, her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. No one cheered. No one cried. They only bore witness, for they knew what had been done was not simply revenge. It was the settling of a debt that had weighed on every back, every scar, every stolen child. By morning, word had spread beyond the quarters. Some whispered that Hannah had been taken by the storm itself, vanished into thunderclouds like a spirit summoned home. Others swore they saw her walking calmly into the swamps, chains trailing behind her like a crown of iron, and some insisted she never left at all, that her silence still lingers in the house, in the creak of its floorboards, in the rattle of unseen chains at night. The plantation did not survive her act. The colonel returned weeks later to find his legacy in ruins. Workers refused to remain. Crops rotted in the fields. The big house, once filled with arrogant laughter, stood hollow, its walls stained with memory. Those who passed it at night claimed they saw figures in the windows, pale faces pressed to the glass, and heard the faint clink of shackles dragging across the floor. Hannah herself became more than a woman. She became a story, told in whispers around firesides and carried down through generations. A story of vengeance not written in courts or books, but in thunder, chains, and blood. Some said she was a warning, that the oppressed can rise and devour their oppressors when silence ripens into fury. Oh, theirs said she was a protector, her spirit guarding those who still bore shackles in their own time. Even now, in the deep woods of Mississippi, there are those who will not walk past the ruins of the Tate plantation after dark. They say if you listen closely, you can hear chains moving in the earth, as if the soil itself remembers. And if you hear them, you must bow your head. For it is not the sound of bondage. It is the sound of Hannah, reminding the world that silence can kill, and that debts written in suffering will, one day, be paid.